Welcome to Smarsh Advance. Today's topic is emerging threats of hybrid work. This is your host, Sid Yanamandra. I'm the CEO, co-founder of Entrada. Today, I'm excited to have a distinguished guest join us, Dr. Neil Daswani. He's a cybersecurity expert in the industry. He's a co-director of Stanford's cybersecurity education program. He has a PhD from Stanford, ex-Googler, co-founded a startup called Dacient, which was acquired by Twitter, and then joined LifeLock as Chief Information Security Officer. Neil's written actually two books in cybersecurity. His most recent book is named The Big Breaches. Super excited to have Neil join us today. Welcome, Neil.
Thank you, Sid, for having me.
Great. So Neil, to kind of start our session today, the topic, as you know, is about hybrid work. And, we've all sort of been in this environment, in the COVID environment over this past year and a half. Things have changed quite a bit from an enterprise IT risk modeling standpoint. So I have some things that I wanted to discuss with you, Neil, and just to kind of get your take on things. Given the new work from home paradigm, what are you seeing as some of the big changes in the way enterprises are managing sort of IT risk? How do you see them sort of evolving given the new paradigm?
I'd be more than happy to comment on that. And in my work, in my consulting practice and otherwise, I spend a lot of time talking to CISOs, and it's interesting what's taken place over the past year and a half. So to an extent, if I put my academic hat on as a computer scientist, to an extent, there haven't been any kind of fundamental major changes. From a practical perspective, there has been a day and night difference between where things were a year and a half ago at the outset of the pandemic and now. And so if we look at where the world was back in, say, March 2020, before a lot of companies had to open up to lots of employees coming in remotely right away, the concept of remote work and BYOD was around, and many companies had, say, a good 20% or more of their workforce coming in remotely. So there were, a set of threats that come from when you work from home or work remotely. You might be coming in from an unsecured router. Your machine could get infected. There may be no easy way to figure out whether or not encryption is turned on your device. And that had all existed prior to. But one thing to think about is, if we just take a canonical example of a company and what the conversation was probably like between the CEO and the CISO, if, say, a direct conversation happened, it would probably go something like this. CEO says to the Chief Information Security Officer, we cannot have our employees come in anymore to the offices. And while, say, 20% of our workforce might have been working remote, I now need you to enable 95% of our workforce to come in remotely. So, of course, given the situation, the CISO wants to support the CEO and the company goals, simply because you can't shut the company down. You need to have the company continue to function. But if you think about the fact that many CISOs maybe or CIOs might have only provisioned their virtual private networks, their VPNs, to support a workforce that was 20% remote, they are now being asked to go 95% right away. And so how do they do that? Well, they could try buying a lot more site licenses really fast, but that's going to cost quite a bit. And it may take some time. You could imagine every company in the world would be asking their VPN provider for more site licenses. And you need to get things running now. So companies might have had to switch from, say, full tunneling their traffic, where everything goes from the, corporate issued end device or a BYOD device, through all the enterprise defenses and through the full VPN, right? But there is not enough bandwidth to support it. So a lot of folks had to switch from full tunneling to split tunneling. So then a lot of the traffic that was going back and forth to their devices no longer goes through the VPN, no longer goes through all the enterprise defenses that may have been invested in for over a decade. And so the CISO is going to go ahead and support that. But now we're a year and a half later. How many organizations have gone back at the board level and said, okay, look, our cybersecurity posture fundamentally changed. There had been more phishing attacks coming with subject lines of COVID in them, and all kinds of things getting worse. Many more people coming in from unsecured routers. How many companies have gone back? So to an extent, from a pure computer science perspective, remote work had existed before the pandemic. It exists after the pandemic, but in practice, there's a big change in how much traffic has come in, and it's not quite clear to me how many organizations really went back and then further hardened back down their security posture, given all the changes when they went into the pandemic.
Excellent points there, Neil. So a couple of questions there, right, as follow-up, Neil. Do you find that organizations have to prepare for a different kind of a threat landscape now that folks are working from home? You talked a little bit about how remote work has existed before. So this is not a new paradigm. Perhaps the percentage of people now working from home has increased. But the threat landscape, have you seen that dramatically change as a result of more people working from home?
So the answer to that is yes. So if we think about the fact that most employees have a pretty much completely unmanaged home router, right? If someone's running a home router and it has the default password, it's very easy for an attacker to break into that router and change the DNS setting, the service that's responsible for converting the domain name google.com or yahoo.com or your bank.com into an IP address. Once an attacker is able to interfere with that translation, they could pretty much provide you with imposter sites at will. The employees might think they're going to their company, they're really not. They might think they're going to the bank, they're really not. So unmanaged routers are a very serious issue, simply because they're the gateway to the internet. You control that, you control everything. And so there are some institutions that I know of that at the outset of the pandemic, and this was a financial institution, for example, they bought new home routers for everybody that the company could manage in order to deal with a lot of those threats and changes to the threat landscape. You have to also keep in mind that behind people's home routers are tons of Internet of Things devices, Amazon Alexas and webcams and whatnot. And there have been serious abuses of those kinds of devices in the past. Back in 2016, there was a botnet called Mirai that infected a whole bunch of IoT devices and webcams and started generating enough denial of service traffic that it knocked out Netflix and Spotify for hours. And right. So, all of those threats are just magnified now. And so, basically, there are significant changes to the landscape, and one has to deploy more protections. There's also this concept of zero trust. So basically, if companies have not bought new routers for their employees to use at home, they've still got to deal with these threats in one way or the other. There's many organizations that were embarking upon using the concept of zero trust and deploying more of a zero trust environment. But it's not quite clear that all organizations have been able to accelerate their zero trust journeys to get to a cybersecurity posture that can withstand the changed threat landscape environment.
Yeah, one of the things, Neil, that we're seeing in the industry, particularly over the last 18 months, is there's been a dramatic increase in the number of ransomware attacks. Also, some of the biggest supply chain attacks, with Kaseya being breached and SolarFlare being breached, and these are all public now. Do you feel like these attacks have increased dramatically as a result of COVID? Has COVID exacerbated this whole concept of hybrid work? Has that exacerbated this problem, or was it already on sort of the ascendancy or a rise?
I'd say it was already on the ascendancy, and it made it worse. For instance, you mentioned SolarWinds, for example. The SolarWinds attack, while FireEye Mandiant discovered it in mid-December 2020, the attackers had laid the groundwork down actually well before the pandemic started, right? So they had compromised SolarWinds, that compromised a bunch of the SolarWinds customers. And what they did is they accelerated their exfiltration of data during the pandemic, when to an extent attackers probably knew that a lot of companies had lost as much visibility as they had before. I'm glad that you mentioned ransomware. Ransomware has also been on serious rise. As per stats from the Identity Theft Resource Center, ransomware is now only second to phishing in terms of initial compromise vectors or compromise vectors in general. And in fact, if we look at, for instance, the Colonial Oil Pipeline attack that occurred earlier this year, where attackers got in, there is a relation between remote work configuration and ransomware. So while everyone probably knows that the Colonial Pipeline was shut down due to ransomware, what everyone might not know is that the way that the attackers got in and planted ransomware inside of Colonial Oil Pipeline is that the attacker had stolen a VPN password. Chances are there was an employee at Colonial Oil Pipeline that might have used the same password for some personal account as they did for their corporate login, and the attacker may have been able to steal that personal password from the dark web. And that, combined with the fact that they did not have two-factor authentication deployed for the VPN, allowed the attackers to get into Colonial Oil Pipeline and plant the ransomware. And then, of course, they were shut down for over a week. They actually paid over $4 million in ransom in Bitcoin, and oil prices started going up. I mean, it was quite a mess. One interesting thing is that the authorities were able to get back most of the Bitcoin, even though Bitcoin is supposed to kind of be untraceable or whatnot. That hopefully sends a strong message. But basically, there is a relation between hybrid work environment and as an initial compromise vector and ransomware as what you do once you get in. And these issues have just gotten exacerbated in the pandemic.
Yeah, and it's a funny story with the Colonial Pipeline issue, because yes, the attackers were able to infiltrate and plant ransomware. It's interesting to know that it was because of a VPN password that was compromised. The FBI was able to compromise the attackers' Bitcoin wallet because they didn't have multi-factor authentication turned on for their Bitcoin wallet. So it's kind of an interesting twist to the story. So whether you're the attacker or the person getting attacked, multi-factor authentication is an important consideration.
Yes, that's exactly.
So Neil, we talked a little bit about BYOD and enterprise IT risk models changing given, the whole hybrid work paradigm. The one question that we deal with a lot in our industry is we deal a lot with financial firms that have a large independent contractor base. So you take a large broker-dealer, right, that has a number of advisors that are on the platform that they have to manage cybersecurity risk for. It's hard enough to manage cyber risk within the four walls of a company. Now, when you've got a large network of 1099s or contractors, you kind of run into this weird dynamic between supply chain risk, because these folks are technically contractors, so you have to vet them. But then they're more than contractors because they have access to your critical systems, which means you need to have more monitoring in place. How do you draw the line between sort of the employee where you can manage everything because it's corporate issued versus 1099s where you kind of have to still manage that in a different way? Does that make sense?
Absolutely. Neil? I think that given when you're in an environment with so many 1099 contractors, they're using their own devices. You have
Right.
less control, right? The question is, and by the way, it sounds like you're in a space where these are financial advisors. I mean, they have access to, serious assets for their customers, right?
Correct.
Um, it could be quite challenging to achieve security if you don't take certain steps. So, for instance, on the devices that the 1099 contractors are using, how do you even know they have a password enabled on their computer? How do you know
Right.
if they have encryption turned on to protect the client's information? How do you know that they're running some kind of endpoint or anti-malware protection software? If you don't know any of those things, you're just pretty much asking for trouble. And God forbid, if any of those folks have admin privileges to any system, to an extent, if they come in unfettered, I mean, the situation looks very similar to a serious adversary breaking in. And so, if you can deploy an agent on their devices, so it gives you some visibility to check that they do have passwords enabled, they do have encryption turned on, they are running anti-malware protection, and you can you can get some attestation to the security of the device, uh, combined together with making sure that they have legitimate credentials and, say, two-factor authentication on, then it really, really helps a lot in lowering the cyber risk of such a distributed workforce, which is mostly consisting of contractors.
Yeah, and that's very well put, Neil. I mean, one of the big things that we see is, particularly with 1099s, you sort of have to manage, if they have access to critical assets, you have to manage them the same way as you would manage an employee, except now you've got a large number of BYOD infrastructure. You have networks. Folks are working from their own house. They're working from their own offices. They've got their own personal devices. There's commingling of personal and business assets. And so you sort of have to be careful. The psychology matters more than just the pure technology, but you need to be able to balance them both. So very well said. Now, Neil, the one question that we keep getting asked in our industry is, if you have an organization that built a cybersecurity perimeter around around their company, around their organization, and then went and underwrote cyber insurance based on certain core assumptions of what those controls were going to be, do you think that the hybrid work model would completely derail those risk and those underwriting functions that were already in place, given that the company had invested in perimeter security? Now you've got everybody working from home. Does that fundamentally change the risk paradigm?
Absolutely, it does fundamentally change the risk posture. So first of all, even if you have a perimeter, right? Modern day cybersecurity philosophy is that just because a machine can connect to something within the perimeter does not mean that there's any more security around that device. The user's credentials could have been compromised. The device could get infected by malware at any time. You can visit any random website these days and get infected by an ad or some other widget on the page, and the computer's infected within a few hundred milliseconds with no indication, no asking the user to click on anything. So the perimeter security model was, to an extent, a bit hosed even before hybrid work entered the picture. And the whole concept of zero trust in cybersecurity is about not making any trust assumptions about the user or the device, and you make the assumption that even if it connected to the network, the user might be compromised, the device might be compromised. So that was already an issue. Now, on top of that, if you had some confidence that you got from having a perimeter, and your cyber insurer had some confidence based on the perimeter, and now you have employees' devices, their own personal devices coming in, without, any agent running on it, without any attestation. I mean, it just makes the whole, you can have much fewer. In fact, you can have much fewer confidences around that. In fact, to an extent, if you made this change, and you have a lot more people coming in doing the hybrid work thing, and you suffer a cybersecurity incident, when you go to file a claim with the cyber insurer, if you've made all these changes to your network to allow, 95% of remote workers to come in, and you don't have the same perimeter security model, and you don't have some some visibility into what's going on their device, and you don't have two-factor authentication on, if you don't have these things, then the cyber insurer, even if you suffer a cyber incident, they may not pay out. They may basically go back to the policy and say, look, you're supposed to be doing all these things with your perimeter security model, and then you move to this hybrid model and you don't have those things anymore. You suffer an incident, we're not going to pay.
Yeah, and that could be catastrophic because, in a lot of cases, if you have an organization dealing with third-party clients, they have to attest to carrying cyber insurance to a certain amount. And now, if your own policies are in question, that it kind of sends the whole thing into a tizzy. So it big issue.
Yes.
Having said that, Neil, what recommendations would you give an organization that is dealing with this, right? Where they underwrote, they had cyber insurance, but it was based on some assumptions. Now the organization evolved, more people working from home, lots of employees, lots of contractors. Do they then contact the cyber insurer and say, hey, the model changed. We need to reassess our risk. And therefore, now, we might be subject to a higher premium. Is that what an organization would have to go do?
I mean, that is certainly one path that an organization can take. And certainly they should reach out to their cyber insurer, and, the amount of the premium increase could be significant. Another alternative might be to deploy software and services like the kind that Entrada provides to get their risk posture kind of under control before they reach out to the cyber insurer, so they can at least show that they've been proactive in managing the situation. And then the other recommendation that I would have is that the organization, wherever it was on its path and journey to achieve zero trust, it should accelerate that as significantly as possible. So I think that it is really important to own the risk, because getting a cyber insurance policy allows you to transfer the risk when you're abiding by the terms of the agreement. And if you're not abiding by the terms of agreement, all bets could be off. In fact, there's been a bunch of organizations that have gotten hit by ransomware, and basically their cyber insurers have turned around and said, look, you can't file a claim and then use the claim money to pay the ransom anymore. I think that sets up the right precedent, but the amount of protections that you thought you might have may no longer exist if you don't own the risk and manage the situation.
Yeah, and all great points. When it comes to cyber insurance, it's a hot topic. Neil, jumping back to zero trust, right? So you talked quite a bit about zero trust and why organizations should embrace that as a philosophy. I find that a lot of folks don't quite understand what zero trust is. It means a lot of different things to a lot of different people, and it gets tossed around a lot as sort of a catch-all phrase. In your mind, how would you define zero trust? What are the core tenets of what makes a zero trust framework?
Sure. So let me comment on that, because zero trust has become just a huge buzzword in the industry, and the concept of zero trust actually goes back decades, to some security principles developed by Salzer and Schroeder in the 60s and 70s. But I'd say that about 12 to 14 years ago, in the aftermath of the Aurora attack that hit Google and 36 other companies, there's kind of two reinvigorations of the concept of zero trust. And there's a gentleman at Forrester Research that is said to have coined or recoined the term, and then Google has an implementation of zero trust called BeyondCorp, But if you go back to, for instance, the original Google papers on this, the research papers, basically the original model was to say, look, we cannot trust a machine or a user just because they can get on the corporate network. At some point, any and every user and any every device could get compromised. So how do we allow users and how do we allow devices to function and how do we allow networks to function in this environment where at any time an inside employee's machine can get compromised or their credentials can get compromised, like say via the dark web. And so basically, if you look at, for instance, Google's Beyond Corp paper in Usenix Security back from 2014. And by the way, it took Google quite a few years to get their zero trust implementation to a significant point. One of the key tenets is that when a user or device attempts to connect in to kind of a corporate network, the user needs to be continuously authenticated. They need to be authenticated when they come in, ideally via multi-factor authentication, and they need to be re-authenticated even while the session's taking place. Sometimes that can happen in an automated way. And then secondly, the device, even if the device had joined the corporate network before, you've got to assume that it might have gotten infected in between the last time it connected and this time it comes in. So you've got to, reattest the security of the device before you start letting it interact with things on the network. And to an extent, if you think about a pure zero trust network, if you follow the model, basically it says you don't trust any machine or any user depending upon what network they come in from. Anybody should be able to come in from anywhere. And in a pure zero trust network, you don't even need a VPN. Basically, the device will come in and authenticate itself to the server, and the user's credentials will be used to authenticate that user. You have to assume that there could have been a compromise all along, but you've got to re-authenticate, retest, and only then do you allow that user and machine to start interacting with the network. So I hope that kind of explains zero trust from kind of the core philosophies.
Yeah, and I think at the core, what we're finding with zero trust is there's sort of a unification of identity management systems, endpoint posture assessment systems, and maybe some network-related security systems, whether it's perimeter security, whether it's microsegmentation. So it's kind of like this combination of IAM, endpoint posture management, and network security. Would you say that that's within the vicinity?
Yes, exactly. Okay. I think there's the philosophy around zero trust and what is it supposed to accomplish, and why this philosophy makes sense to accomplish that. And then there's the how do you accomplish that. So basically the various countermeasures and mitigations that you mentioned are all super important parts of how you can implement a zero trust philosophy in your corporate network.
Got it. Yeah, no, excellent. Now, kind of moving back to some of the innovations that the industry is experiencing, I should say, collectively. And in your capacity at Stanford and some of the advisory work that you do with a lot of the innovative startups, what are some emerging trends? I mean, what advice would you give an organization like ours that's sort of working on sort of next generation endpoint posture management, supply chain risk, third party vendor due diligence? What are some of the next sort of big innovations that we need to keep an eye on?
Sure. Let me comment on both trends and innovations. So there's three trends that I'll mention. I think that number one, remote workers will be here to stay well even after the pandemic subsides. If it used to be the case that 20% of people used to do remote work before the pandemic and during the pandemic, maybe 95% of remote workers used to be remote. Even when people start returning to offices, I wouldn't be surprised if 40, 50, 60% of the workforce now regularly comes in remotely. One of the things that the pandemic has done is it's accelerated the future of remote work. There's basically a whole bunch of people and technologies and companies that focus on the future of work, and a whole bunch of things that they were kind of predicting and gearing up for got accelerated during the pandemic. And I just don't think that's going to go away. So that's trend number one. Trend number two is that I think that ransomware prevalence will continue to increase. It's been a significant cause for breaches in the first 3 quarters of this year. Much more so than last year and the year before. I think that's only going to continue. And then the third trend that I'll mention is that in the aftermath of the SolarWinds hack, there's going to be a lot more focus on supply chain security. So when Biden issued his executive order that directed a whole bunch of agencies to start taking steps to put in more compliance, more regulation, more guidelines, that's going to be a driving force that will trickle down and affect many other things in the private sector. So I think those are three interesting trends. With regards to innovations, I think even in the immediate aftermath of the SolarWinds hack, for instance, where the attackers came in and broke in, as per some of the root causes of breach that I talk about in the Big Breaches book, they will continue to make compromises due to phishing and account takeover, malware, software vulnerabilities, unencrypted data, supply chain attacks. That'll all continue. But in terms of innovations beyond the that are needed to satisfy some of the additional standards and guidelines that will come down the pipe. If you look at SolarWinds themselves, they basically said, look, after the attackers initially broke in, what they did is they infiltrated the build pipeline for their Orion product, and the attackers inserted a backdoor into the code for that Orion product, and then basically used that backdoor to be able to issue and send out code of their own choice and malware of their own choice into the base of the 300,000 customers that use SolarWinds. So, like, one innovation that SolarWinds was experimenting with is they said, look, we cannot just have like one build pipeline anymore, where we just assume that the right product is going to come out at the end of that, the right build is going to come out at the end of that. Basically, they were looking at running multiple build pipelines in multiple locations, ideally, hopefully using heterogeneous technologies. And so basically, when they compile their product and they get a binary that they're thinking about issuing out to their customers, what they do is they're going to compare the resulting set of files that makes up their product. And if it comes out different in the 2 or the 3 different places, if it's different even once, hey, that means that there might have been a compromise, and they can't trust the output of that build pipeline. Now, it'll be interesting to see how impactful, say, perhaps that innovation is, and if there might be some company that commercializes that and allows other software vendors to do similar things for their build pipelines. But I have seen, just in my own kind of investment activity and whatnot, I have seen more startups focus on this area of supply chain security, and I think that's gonna continue.
Got it. What is the role of AI, you think, and ML models in fighting some of the future threats, the 0 days that we haven't seen yet?
I'd be happy to comment on that. So one of the challenges that we have in the field of cybersecurity is that the field is massively understaffed. There are about 1 million people working in the cybersecurity field in the United States. There's over 450,000 open jobs. So what this means is that for every person in the field, we need another half a person right away, which is a pretty significant amount. And there's no way that we're going to be able to produce enough people. I mean, heck, in our programs at Stanford, the Stanford Advanced Cybersecurity Program that I co-direct together with Dan Bonet and John Mitchell, we help bring more people into the cybersecurity field. We've helped bring over 2,000 people into the field and actually get a full cybersecurity certification. But comparing that to the number of people needed is just huge. So given that we can't educate people fast enough, artificial intelligence has a super important role. What we need to do is take, for instance, the most basic jobs in the field, right? Like, for instance, a level 1 security analyst. We need to automate away those jobs as much as possible and train the people that want to enter the field to help us do more automation instead of just fighting, say, one phishing attack at a time or fighting one malware attack at a time. What AI can do is look at the work that such folks do on a day-to-day basis, identify patterns, and basically have computers do that work as much as possible, or at least assist the humans that are doing that work by providing them with decision support and help them, automate the steps that they need to take. So I think that there is a huge opportunity to use artificial intelligence to help automate away some of those jobs so that the humans can focus on more impactful things that you really need people's brain cells for. And I'd say that though there also there's also risks. So artificial intelligence can be used to help implement cybersecurity, but one of the challenges is that we can't always just blindly also trust the AI. AI models, if an attacker can poison training data for AI models, then basically that can be a way for them to kind of get a backdoor in the system. So if you've heard about these cases where, if there's, for instance, a surveillance camera that can identify a human's face, there's a set of sunglasses that you can wear to get the camera to think that you're somebody else. So I think that there's both opportunity to leverage AI, but we also need to be careful of the peril and make sure that we defend the AI from getting abused or compromised or taken advantage of.
No, that's great. These are great comments. So I think we're right up on the hour. I wanted to thank you, Neil, for all your insights. It was really, really intriguing to learn more about some of the work you're doing and some of the challenges that the industry is facing. I wanted to thank you all for joining me for this episode of Smarsh Advanced. Have a wonderful day. Thank you.